Well, it's nice to meet all of you, and thank you for having me here. It's really exciting to learn about what you're doing at CalPE and how you're forming a rebirth of this property and this touchstone in your community. You know, this is sort of a time all across the country when people are rethinking history and being aware of parts of history that we just haven't known. As David was saying, you know, people have grown up around these things and just not known the amazing things that happened in their community. So you all are sort of ahead of the game. You've got a lot of the legwork done and you're ready to go. So that's really great. Nikki asked me to share with you just some of my knowledge about the early work of the NAACP in Virginia, particularly as it relates to Pulaski County. So I'll just tell you some of what I know. I had, as he said, a long career with the Virginian Pilot, which is over in Norfolk, covering state government and politics and writing editorials. And then after I retired in 2008, I finished up a book that I was working on about letters to and from my mother, who died when I was 3. That was Finding Sarah. And then I turned my attention to 2 men that I'd been interested in for a long time. Richmond lawyers, Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson. I wondered, did any of you know those men? Did anyone know Oliver Hill, for instance? Mr. Russell, you probably did.
I have met Oliver Hill. In fact, had the pleasure of presenting him with a Spingarn medal from the NAACP.
Great, yes. And Judge Robinson, he's a little less known, but he, of course, had just a stellar career also.
I'm very familiar with his career, never met him.
Okay.
And I knew Hill from being here in Roanoke.
Good. So both of these men were alive when I was reporting, but they had passed by the time I began my research on the book. Mr. Hill was the last to die in 2007. He was 100 years old. I got to spend just a little bit of time with him, and really I think of it as one of the highlight moments of my career, because at the 40th anniversary of Brown, I met him at the courtroom down at the federal courthouse on Main Street in Richmond, where he and Judge Robinson and Robert Carter argued the Kay Davis case that became part of Brown v. Board. And to sit with him there and just have him pull out his memories was just a wonderful moment. And also at that time, I talked with Judge Robinson briefly. It was the only time I talked with him, and he thought about it, but then declined an interview because he was still a sitting judge at that time. And he just had these strong scruples about not being appearing partisan or whatever in any way. So, but I did have that little bit of insight into them. When I started doing the research, I think maybe like a lot of Virginians, I knew they were great men. I knew they'd been involved with Brown v. Board, but I really did not know the details of their life or all that contributed to this sort of outsized reputations that they had. And I wanted to find out. So what I found through my research was that they really were the most significant grassroots team of lawyers in the South working for the NAACP during the 1940s and into the 1950s. And there are 3 reasons that they were so important. One was that they were key members of this tiny brotherhood that was, and it really was a brotherhood, there weren't very many sisters involved, but that around Thurgood Marshall and the Howard Law School. And they would meet, Hill and Robinson would come up from Richmond, and Marshall and his cronies would come down from DC. They would meet there in Washington, and they really thought through and argued and came up with the strategies that were a big part of the legal demise of Jim Crow segregation. So first thing that we remember them for is this brotherhood and the work that they did in the planning. And then second, the 2 of them had some really very significant court cases in addition to the Brown case. They worked in education, housing, and transportation. And in all of those areas, they had numerous cases that really contributed in major ways to the demise of segregation. And then third, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, they carried out in the courts what was called a school equalization campaign. And the goal was to highlight the disparities between Black and white schools in Virginia, and then to bring legal challenges under the Pulaski standard of separate but equal. And at one point, they had legal actions pending in 75 districts in Virginia, including Pulaski. So this is where Pulaski comes in, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the work that they did really helped establish in a clear way the impossibility of actually having separate and equal schools. They just demonstrated in multiple ways that even when they won cases in court, communities, including Pulaski, did not carry through on the orders that had been given. And it just became clear that you were not going to have truly equal schools if they were separate. So I'd like to tell you just a little bit about each of these men. Spotswood Robinson was born in 1916. He was 9 years Mr. Hill's junior. He came from a silk stocking Black family in Richmond. His grandfather, by reputation, had walked away from the farm outside Richmond where he was enslaved and sort of melded into the free Black community in Richmond and became a prosperous saloon owner. Judge Robinson's father was a lawyer himself and also had a thriving real estate business. So when Spotswood Robinson, when the third, wound up at Howard Law School, he acquired what was reputed to be the highest grade point average ever in the history of the law school. And I found that when I was researching that his record stood into 2010, so a long time. He graduated in 1939, and he delayed in taking the bar exam because despite his brilliance, somehow he was really nervous about taking that. And I think it was that he was just such a perfectionist that he wanted to make sure he did not miss any area of the law. But then World War II came and Oliver Hill was going away into the Army, and someone had to take over the legal business of the NAACP in Virginia by heading that up. And so he went ahead and took the bar and of course passed it and became a lawyer. Through the years, he would become the dean of the Howard Law School from 1960 to 64. Then he became a federal district judge, one of the first Black district judges, federal district judges in the country. And he eventually became chief judge of the DC Court of Appeals from 1981 to 1986, which of course is viewed as the second most important court in the land. And the people who were serving on that court when he was chief judge included Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Robert Bork. So really these names that are so well known. He died in 1998. His personality was so interesting. He was a workaholic. He was a perfectionist. He was a kind and gracious person, but he was also someone who was just comfortable working long hours by himself. He liked to fish. He was a craftsman, and he built a fishing boat without nails and also designed and oversaw the building of this very modern home modern at the time, 1950s, behind Virginia Union in Richmond. He was so meticulous that he once wrote an appellate opinion that had 676 footnotes, which is considered to be some kind of record for you lawyers there. And he was so scrupulously honest that by reputation, when he would leave the courthouse late at night, no cars out, he would refuse to jaywalk. He would go to the corner and go across with the light. Thurgood Marshall relied deeply on Robinson's thoroughness and his intellectual acumen. In personalities, they were salt and pepper. They were really different. And I think probably that was part of the attraction for Marshall. He just knew that he could trust so much whatever work he did. And when the lawyers, and there were lawyers from all over the country who worked on the Brown pleadings, but Marshall tapped Robinson when all that was over to perfect the briefs that went to the Supreme Court, which was as high an indication of trust as you can imagine. So that's Mr. Robinson. So Mr. Hill, as you know, was sort of the face and soul of the civil rights movement in Virginia. By contrast with Judge Robinson, he was robust and earthy and fearless, very engaging. You might call him an alpha male, I think. He was really unafraid to push the political establishment, but he also could be very pragmatic in working with white political leaders. In the 1940s, he would round up Black children who were not being denied transportation to school. He would load them into a bus or a truck and take them off to the nearest white school, march them in, demand that they be enrolled. Of course, they never were enrolled, but soon, often those children would find that they had transportation because there would be court challenges accompanying that action. When he ran for city council in Richmond in 1948, he often was not invited to forums. He would read where they were in the newspaper and he would show up anyway and would become part of the discussion. For 20 years, he headed the legal staff of the NAACP, the Virginia Conference of Branches of the NAACP, which was widely viewed as one of the best, if not the best in the nation. And really, he was a person to whom others looked for leadership and inspiration. In 1948, when he came back from World War II, he was elected to one 2-year term on the Richmond City Council, which was a pretty amazing feat for the times. He lost by just a handful of votes 2 years later. And there was, in his papers, there are a lot of letters from white leaders as well as Black lamenting the fact that he had lost because he had been so effective on the council. Over the years, he received the highest awards of the American Bar Association, National Bar Association, the NAACP, as Mr. Russell had the honor of presenting that award. And he received a Presidential Medal of Freedom under Bill Clinton. So really, these were just outstanding individuals and part of the Virginia landscape of which we can be proud. So now to Pulaski County. My research in We Face the Dawn, which is the book about these two men, included looking at the federal lawsuit that was filed in the county in 1947. And it was an attempt to get more equal education for the Black high school students who were bused to the Christiansburg Industrial Institute in Cambria. That, as you know, was the sole regional high school for Black students from Pulaski and Montgomery counties and the town of Radford. There was no Black high school in Pulaski County. The research that I did focused on the high school case, not on the elementary schools. And so it may be that there's more in the record about Calvi and the other elementary schools that I didn't record, but I did, in my notes, I went back and looked after Mickey got in touch with me, and in the court decisions themselves, there are some references to the elementary schools. So the argument of Robinson and Hill and their colleagues, Martin A. Martin, who was their third partner and who deserves mention, although he's not as well known, he died earlier and did not have as much of a public profile, but he was an excellent trial lawyer and really was very important in the cases they did. But anyway, the argument that they made focused on the disparity between public education at the Christiansburg Institute and at the all-white Pulaski High School. For instance, and you know this history, or most of you do, but I'll go through it again for anyone who might not. The Black children were forced to make a roughly 60-mile round trip each day to school, and that was far more than for most of the white children at that time. The white leaders argued that some white children in the county endured a similar commute. But Robinson pointed out that the difference was that white children and their parents at least had the option of moving closer to a school building within the county. But Black children did not have that option, and their parents, no matter where they moved, they would have to go out of the county. I would say if you've had a chance to read any of the arguments in this case, Judge Robinson wrote much of them, and you can, I mean, his work is so distinctive. It is just so clear and precise. And so it's a joy really to read. The lawyers also pointed out the disparities in the school plants. So the Institute Science Room, for instance, had no Bunsen burners. It had one sink with 2 faucets. It was really a poor cousin to the well-equipped Pulaski High School. The only equipment in the physical education room was 2 tables that might be used for non-regulation ping pong. And of course, that was a far cry from the fully equipped gymnasium that was at the White High School. In May 1949, the federal district court judge, Alfred Barksdale, ruled against the Black plaintiffs in the case. And this is a quote from him. He said, "Public free schools cannot be brought to every man's door." At that time, Pulaski was not the only locality in Virginia that did not have Black schools. There were a number of counties around the state where this was the case. And he was arguing that if you change things here, then there would be all sorts of problems throughout the state. And we just can't bring public education to every man's doorstep. So astonishingly for the times, and you probably know this too, when that case went up to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, a 3-judge panel there, ruling 6 months later, overturned the lower court ruling. And this was one of the early indications that things were beginning to change in the federal judiciary. What the appeals court panel ruled was that there were, quote, rather glaring inequity, it said, between the 2 schools. And they said, quote, "It can hardly be denied that this discrimination is due to race and color." So they recognized the reality that it simply did not come anywhere close to meeting the Plessy standard. The panel, in its opinion, did make some mention of the county's elementary schools, and it noted that the Calfee Training School, which of course was serving Black children in Pulaski, then was the newest building in the county, because I guess of the fire that had destroyed the earlier building, and that it compared favorably with all elementary schools, white or Black. However, the court also found that there had been no study of conditions at 3 other Black elementary schools: the William Gresham School at New River, the Draper School at Draper, and the Rich Hill School at Alsonia. And this is quoting from the court order. They said specific findings should be made as to each of the colored elementary schools, and the court should determine as to each of them whether or not discrimination exists. So that, again, was a forward-thinking thing. We can't just do averages because there's one school that's decent. We need to look at each of these schools. I don't know that that ever occurred. I doubt that it did. You may know. But so far as the Christiansburg Institute was concerned, local officials essentially just ignored the ruling. They elected not to appeal to the US Supreme Court because they feared that they might lose there as well. So they just dug in at the heels and did nothing. The case would prove to be one of the last lawsuits nationwide brought by the NAACP to equalize Black and white schools. And 7 months later, in June 1950, the NAACP reached its historic decision to switch tactics and deciding that it was going to go full bore for desegregation. So the following spring after that, in May of 1951, Mr. Hill and Mr. Robinson were en route to Pulaski County, where they planned to file a motion requesting desegregation of the local schools. And they were acting there on behalf of 24 parents and their children, some of whom we are honored to have with us, who were involved in the original Pulaski school case. A press release that I came across from the Virginia State Conference of the NAACP noted that elementary school facilities for Black children in the county were vastly inferior to white schools, and that the county, in defiance of the 1949 Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruling, still operated no Black high school within the county. On the way to Pulaski that day, Mr. Hill and Mr. Robinson stopped off in Farmville to meet with students who had staged a walkout a couple of days earlier, led by 16-year-old Barbara Rose Johns at the R.R. Moten School there, of course. The lawyers had no intention of filing a desegregation case in their rural outposts. They figured that was one of the worst places they could do it. They did not want to be in a rural community that in which white control was so extreme. But they were so impressed by the students' resolve that they changed their minds. And as you know, that then a month or so later, they filed the court case that became part of Brown v. Board. There was an NAACP press release at the time that linked the Pulaski and Prince Edward County cases. It observed that the pair of cases gave the lie to the claim of Virginia Congressman and former Governor William Tuck, who had said prominently that, quote, the Negroes of my state are satisfied with segregation. And so the NAACP pointed to you, to your community, and to what was happening in Farmville, and saying this is proof that that is not true. So that's where my research took me in terms of Pulaski. Mickey asked me to tell you about my other books. I'll just tell you very briefly. The first one was in 1986, I guess. I had a fellowship to travel around the South, the journalism fellowship, to look at the results of the Voting Rights Act at the 20th anniversary of passage of that act. And I was able to go to places like Sunflower County, Mississippi, where little had changed, and places like Atlanta, where there was a whole new world, and all sorts of places in between. The second book, Claiming the Dream, was about Doug Wilder's election as governor, as the first elected Black governor in our country's history. And the third book, An Expendable Man, was about Earl Washington Jr. and his case. He was on death row in Virginia, and of course turned out to be innocent. And then the next book was the one about my mother and her letters, and then the book about Judge Robinson and Mr. Hill. And the book that I have coming out this fall is about Ralph Northam, our former governor, and his evolution from the blackface scandal. And the name of it is What the Eyes Can't See, Ralph Northam, Black Resolve, and a Racial Reckoning in Virginia. And the book, I had thought that the book on Hill and Robinson would be the last that I would do, but when Governor Northam announced that he was taking down the Lee statue, that just struck me as such a sort of amazing evolution from the blackface scandal to that. And so I was able to spend time with him and with his people over the next 2 years, and also with several members of the Legislative Black Caucus who were very interesting in sort of pushing and encouraging and threatening on occasion him to do various things that he then did. And of course, as you know, his term really wound up probably as the most racially progressive in Virginia since the 1880s. So it's a pretty remarkable story, I think, and I look forward to sharing it. So.